Good morning and good afternoon or good evening from wherever you're joining. Appreciate it. So this is a panel on Kubernetes security and cloud native security. There is a perception out there, unfortunately, that Kubernetes security is insecure by default. But I have a panel, an August panel, really. This is the first time I'm doing a panel in August, and there is an August panel joining from every part of the world. I'd like to welcome them first, and then I'll let them introduce themselves. And in the meantime, for those of you who have joined this panel, I'd appreciate if you can use the Q&A box to queue up the questions. You can start queuing them up right now, and I'll start prioritizing them. If you have a question to a particular speaker, feel free to do that, or to a particular company that's represented in the panel. That'll work as well. And if you can, I know this is weird times where we are doing this online. It's hard to come back and ask clarifying questions. So if you can provide as much context as possible, that'll be great. I have a set of questions that I have queued up, but what I'm going to do here is, hope that you, the attendees, will be asking the questions, and I don't have to fall into my bank. So with that said, let me do a quick intro of myself. My name is Srinivas, and I am a developer myself. I come from really the Java and the Cloud Foundry background, and I just want things to work. I am a big fan of kind of seeing, applications being stood up easily. Big fan of frameworks like Draft and Scaffold and things like that, which makes it kind of approach the same philosophy that Cloud Foundry has. With that, let me pass the baton on to the next panelist.
Hey, I'm Scott Coulton. Oh, yeah, there I am. I'm Scott Coulton. I'm actually in Sydney at the moment, so fun fact, it's 1:45 a.m. in the morning. I work for Microsoft. I'm the developer lead for containers, and my interest is everything to do with like runtimes and Kubernetes security. So that's what I mostly focus all my efforts on.
Perfect. Moving on. Gareth, you there? Okay, we'll come back to Gareth.
I think I'm here now.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I'm Gareth Rushgrove. I'm director of product at a security company called Snyk. I'm also one of the maintainers on the Open Policy Agent project, specifically around ConfTest, which is a little security testing tool I wrote a while ago.
Perfect. Moving on. Kirsten?
Hi, folks. Kirsten Newcomer with Red Hat. My focus is security in the OpenShift stack in Red Hat, and really for me, that means security throughout the stack, from the operating system through Kubernetes to the app dev solutions. And I have a particular interest in DevSecOps. My roles kind of throughout my career have included sysadmin roles, QE, product management, program management, really enjoying working in the Kubernetes, the containers, and kube security space.
Perfect. Let me take a moment to remind attendees again to queue in questions. I don't think I see too many. So, rather than fall back into my question bank, I really would appreciate if you, can queue up the questions so that we are ready to go as soon as the intros are done. Otherwise, like I said, I have a bank, but I am hoping that I'll get some questions. Which that said, thank you, Kirsten. Moving on to Phil.
Hey, everybody. Phil Estes. I work for IBM Cloud. I've had pretty significant involvement in the container runtime space for the last 5+ years, working on Docker and Containerd and the OCI on behalf of IBM Cloud. And more recently have gotten more deeply involved in our IaaS platform stack. So that now includes the operating system below the hypervisor layer. And so I'm very interested in everything from, like Kirsten said, supply chain security, the operating system, the core components at the runtime layer up through the Kubernetes stack. So yeah, looking forward to this discussion.
Perfect. We have a fairly lengthy question here. I see some overlap between operations. I'm going to try to make it public. And some overlap between operations admin running kubectl versus those running application command. And hence we are running into these roles, profiles, configurations, even more complex for operation admins. Is it okay to reuse Kubernetes RBAC even for my application CLI? To keep it simple, also lesser complexity in configuring roles and profiles only at one place, .yaml. What is your opinion on this? Let's start with Phil, since he was on just now. Phil, do you want to take this?
Oh, you gave me a tricky one. Yeah, I don't know if anyone understands the question better than I do. I think I'm understanding that this is more about that line between ops and sort of a developer dealing with the application layer on top of sort of the Kubernetes control plane. So yeah, I don't know, Kirsten or Gareth may have better understanding of kind of that application layer and how that ties into the more Kubernetes control plane RBAC roles.
I can touch on it a little.
So
I think it's
yeah, you start, Gareth. Yeah.
I think ultimately it's like there's not one right answer. Unfortunately, I think it's always going to be about trade-offs and this sort of balance of how much you let Kubernetes bleed through into your applications. Do developers need to know Kubernetes? I think is a question that doesn't have a right answer. It's not binary. It's not yes or no. And I think it's that question you need to ask, which isn't just a security question that like if the answer is yes in your context, then I think reusing Kubernetes primitives, including RBAC, makes a lot of sense. That you get the simplicity from the fact that you're using the same things everywhere. I think in particular in small teams where ultimately you're sort of doing everything, that has benefits. Large organizations where that might be different groups, you're trying to provide more of a PaaS-like experience. I think bleeding through something quite as rich as Kubernetes role-based access control can sort of have like the opposite effect. The security comes in through people not fundamentally understanding RBAC because it's complex. So I think there isn't a definite answer. It does depend, but I think that think about generally whether you want to expose Kubernetes to developers or not.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting perspective, and you are right. You want to have some flexibility depending on the end users you're working with, right? So on the other hand, to really effectively kind of as we see things added to the Kubernetes platform, things like service mesh, you're going to want to have a subset, at least, of your development team who really do understand how to work with the kinds of capabilities like service mesh that are added to the platform or application monitoring. And from that angle, I think you're going to need some team members who have appropriate role-based access to the namespaces that they're working with. And they're going to need to understand, what they're allowed to do and what not allowed to do. So I think it is a mix, but at minimum, I think as we get more and more into cloud native, solutions and add more capabilities for those developers on top of Kube itself, they are going to need to grow in their understanding of the basics of Kube and RBAC. So.
Gotcha. Here's a question that I think is relevant to all the panelists, and I'll start with Scott. The question comes from Jake Klein. Unfortunately, I don't know if I can make it public, but maybe it's public already. But in any case, it's a simple question, but a fairly lengthy answer I would expect. What's holding back Kubernetes from being secure by default? Let's start with Scott.
This is a really interesting one. I was just reading this actually, and I knew you. For some reason, I knew you'd throw this to me. I don't know why. This is a really interesting question, and the reason why I think upstream Kubernetes has so many security configurations that are not turned on by default is because it's meant to be implemented by different folks. And what I mean by that is OpenShift's implementation compared to Azure's implementation compared to GKE's implementation is different. Once you start using like a provider that's building Kubernetes for you, you'll find that there will be secure defaults on for you. I know we do some stuff in Azure, but there's a line in the sand where it's like operability versus security, and there's only so much a provider can do and make it easy for the developer as well. Anything beyond that, it needs to go to like the security professional of that organization, because it could be a nuance that 90% of the customers running on AKS don't need, but 10% of the customers do need. So that's why. And I think as we're getting into, as we just spoke about, service mesh and other capabilities on top of it, secure by default looks a lot different for different folks. Like, like if you take, for example, Istio, and you can't just go, well, we're going to do one policy for identity and that'll work for every customer. It just won't work. So that's why I think there's nothing really holding us back as per se. There's always work we can do, but it comes down to the implementation of Kubernetes and the customer needs. That's what I think the major thing is.
Okay, if you can quickly go around. Gareth, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think I'm following on from Scott's point that when you say Kubernetes, do you mean a distribution of which can come with more opinions, or do you mean the underlying software, which invariably is optimized for distribution, for people to build things on top of it? And I think that's the tension. Ultimately, as well, changing things in hindsight is really hard. So I think now we're sort of 5+ years on, some of the original design decisions could be like, oh, we would do that different in hindsight. But making that change now would fundamentally change, like it sort of make Kubernetes more difficult to adopt for everyone who comes next at this point. I think the addition of RBAC was a good example where the community said, actually, we need to do this. We need to break things in order to make it, to introduce that capability. So there is precedent for Kubernetes being fundamentally breaking backwards compatibility for security reasons. I'd like to see higher level primitives, I think, introducing Kubernetes that have better secure defaults than the lower level ones that are there, pods and deployments even. But also I think there's been a conversation there of like, let's see those things emerge in the community first, and they haven't done yet. And so I think that's where we start outside Kubernetes, have some higher level primitive that sits above deployment, widely adopted with better secure defaults. If that's widely adopted, then let's get it into Kubernetes rather than thinking that's the solution. That's at least what I would like to see.
Perfect. Scott or Phil, do you want to add any? I mean, sorry, Kirsten or Phil, do you want to add anything? Or?
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
just a couple.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think one quick thing that kind of ties in with the idea of distributions or use cases. I think the narrower your use case, the more you can implement sort of a secure by default system. For example, if I build a functions as a service offering with Kubernetes as the substrate, I have a much more limited set of container images that run because maybe I've enforced a certain policy around that. So I think because, and I think Gareth referred to this, Kubernetes, this concept of it's something to build other things with. I think there is this tension between adding all and turning on all these features in the base platform versus what do I build with it, and therefore what can I enforce given my potentially narrower use case than the entire Kubernetes ecosystem.
Perfect. Kirsten, last word.
Sure, great, thanks. So I think everybody's done a great job covering the distribution angle, which I think is absolutely right. This is very similar to what happened with Linux, as Linux has a lot of complexity as well, and you look to the distributions to provide security out of the box and automated ways to configure for security. In addition, I think, when we think about the beginnings, there was originally, I believe, kind of the concept of multi-tenancy for a Kubernetes cluster was not an initial major consideration in the community. And I think that affected a lot of the initial choices. If you really have a single tenant cluster, you can have, there's less need for things like RBAC potentially, et cetera. So I do think it's really going to be interesting to see where the community goes, because I've also seen an uptick in interest in securing Kubernetes in the community recently. Red Hat has had security context constraints as an admission controller from early on to help ensure that malicious containers couldn't be deployed easily onto the container, or privilege escalation was prevented. That became pod security policies upstream. But even though, CIS Kube benchmarks recommend pod security policies, the community's still not convinced about that. So, and I'm starting to see a drift towards OPA and gatekeepers. So to Gareth's point about kind of security that is maybe at a higher level or kind of at the perimeter of the Kube cluster, I think that may be where we start to see the community be interested in investing.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So one note to panelists, you guys are all very congenial, nice to each other. Can we see some disagreement a little bit? I'm just kidding. But in any case, let's go to the next question, which is, how far are we away from the true zero-touch Kubernetes development pipeline ecosystem? How far are we really going as far as not having any human accessible accounts in the system anymore? Just purely token-based access. And who wants to start here?
I can jump
Anybody?
in.
Okay, Gareth, go.
I think it depends on who you are. I think some people will be saying, no, we do this already. And other people will be saying, like, whoa, we're never going to get there. I think that it's a classic, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So I'll rather than saying, is it possible? Can you build this? Can people do this? Because I think the answer is yes. There are people doing this. Is it easy to do? Do you need to do a lot of configuration yourself and a lot of composition yourself of a lot of tools? Yes, absolutely. I think that sort of mythical distribution of everything, I'm not sure that will ever quite exist out of the box, like at least in a sort of time frame that a lot of the people around the Kubernetes community think about, because I think we build components and we integrate components, and at some point, they'll get industrialized, but the component builders will probably move on. So I think if you're just wanting the finished article, it's nearly a generational technology thing. I think if you're a integrator, if you like building things together, this is possible to do today. But it's definitely not the norm. I don't know if anyone else has a different opinion.
No, I was actually going to say really well said.
Perfect.
I think the Kubernetes operators help to move us in that direction.
Go ahead, Kirsten.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that the concept of Kubernetes operators help to move us in the direction where you can start towards less and less human interaction. But I do think that it does kind of require a lot of building and investment. But sort of the combination of operators with the GitOps or Argo CD model, I think create a lot of possibility.
Yeah, I think the fundamental thing there is control loops. Can you manage all operational sort of instructions via some form of control loops, however you implement that? Again, I think the answer is yes, but you will have to build a lot yourself, and that might be a greater cost than you're willing to pay today.
So Joshua Avikal has a question, and it seems simple again. Just like the OWASP top 10, is there a top 10 critical security risks for cloud-native apps? Let's start with Scott again.
I'm not sure on this one if there's a cloud-native one. I have seen some people do some stuff around OWASP and like the Kubernetes API and a few other bits and pieces like that. I'm not sure if there's like an official one you can go to every day that's updated, like the proper OWASP. Does anyone else know if there's like an official?
I've got an opinion here that the answer is actually it is the OWASP top 10. The fact that you're running your applications on Kubernetes versus some other platform versus like with some other new technology doesn't change the fundamentals of application security. The risks outlined in the OWASP top 10 are still the things that are going to get you. Some of them you can actually really apply very specifically to Kubernetes. Configuration risk is one of the sort of issues there. It's always been a problem. It's in there as a sort of popular risk. Popular, maybe the wrong word. But that's a generic problem, like whether you're on Kubernetes or not. Applied to Kubernetes, it's obviously you're going to have a lot of configuration at the moment around a Kubernetes cluster. That's definitely something you should apply to. But I think fundamentally application security hasn't changed with Kubernetes. The OWASP top 10 is still a good list of things to apply.
Great. Gareth, I'll come back to you because there was another question on kind of shifting security left. But let me get to this next question, which is about what do you think is the correct layer to enforce security concepts like image signing? Is it the container runtime? Is it the image registry or some operator within Kubernetes? And I'll let Phil drive this. Phil, if you want to jump in.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question to me, just because, again, I've been mostly focused on the runtime layer and images and OCI distribution. And there's a lot of folks involved here. Most of the cloud providers, most of their registry teams are involved in an effort called Notary V2. I think there was even a talk about it earlier today, or even a working group. So there are a lot of smart people looking at this. Definitely up till now, it's been container runtimes and their implementation of their registry interactions that are handling the image signing capabilities, whether it's Docker with Notary or whether it's the Red Hat tools with GPG simple signing. This is where most of the action has been. I think it is interesting because I work for a cloud provider to try and figure out where the hook should be, because now in my Kubernetes layer, I want to know that somewhere in my stack, the image signature was checked by the right, piece of the stack, and then I can actually trust and verify that happened. Because kind of like what Gareth said, as soon as there's, potential configuration drift and somehow it got turned off or the policy got change that I'm no longer checking image signatures, there are a lot of potential gaps and holes there to make sure that my Kubernetes stack knows how to interact with my runtime layer and my image registry to validate what I'm trying to claim I know. I know where my images came from, and I know who signed them. So anyway, lots of good work happening in this area, but it's definitely something that cloud providers and security folks are very interested in.
Perfect. Anybody has any other opinions or? Okay. The next question comes from Casper Nissen. Thanks for asking the question. And I myself am a developer, so the question is, shifting security left, how do you make developers care about security? Because, as a developer, I really don't want to, do too much, but just make it work, right? So what are your thoughts? Let's start with Kirsten.
Thanks. So I think it's very challenging to make developers care about security. Here's how I think about it. The real value of shifting security left is removing your security team for developers, is removing your security team as a blocker. No developer wants to be told just as they're ready to deploy their app to production that the security team has said, nope, sorry, there's this late breaking problem that we just learned about, and you have to go back and start over. So I think the real value is making it easy for the developers to check and build security in themselves and get sign off from the security team during those early stages. So that, and they're going to get value by knowing they're not going to get blocked at the end.
Gareth, I'm sure you have an opinion on this.
I do, and I'm actually going to cheat a little bit here because I know Casper a little bit. Casper is a software engineer. He's come along to a panel about security, and he's asked that question. I would posit that actually developers, they want to know about security. They do think security is important. I think organizationally, lots of organizations have told them it's not their problem. And that's or they've put up barriers that make security not about technology. And I think there is an aspect of security that's a lot more about information security. There's a risk management aspect. There's a compliance aspect. That's not the same thing as security. And organizations in lots of cases have sort of put those two together, put them to a department that deals with risk and compliance, and then said, oh, we've got a security department. Oh, don't worry, developers, you don't need to worry about security anymore. I think it's organizational, that is organizations and organizational structures that have been the problem. I think if you say, hey, security is interesting. I mean, that's how I got into security from being a developer. I got to do some security work, and it was interesting. I think developers are interested, in security. Organizations block them from learning more, doing more, and conflate security with risk and compliance. So I think change your organization to allow developers to become interested, to allow developers to embrace their interest in security.
Perfect. Next question. I know that Scott is very interested in pod security, and this is a question from Beth Perisu. Hopefully I'm saying it right. Some enterprise users want to see enhancements to upstream pod level security. Is that on the roadmap or in scope for Kubernetes?
Well, yes, this is a really interesting one, and this is something that I'm really interested in. You'll notice that pod security policy has kind of been in limbo for quite a while. And this kind of goes back to what Gareth was saying about before. Does pod security policy need to be in Kubernetes, or does it need to be abstracted outside of the distribution and then handled by something like Open Policy Agent? So at the moment, there is more than just OPA as well. There's other projects out there, open source projects that are trying to achieve the same thing. So what we're starting to see is like increased capabilities there, and then having it plug into like the distribution of Kubernetes. Because one of the issues we'll have is if we keep building Kubernetes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger with all these things, it comes with consequences as well. So this is one of the first projects that I've seen where they're looking at something that's in base Kubernetes at the moment, and they're looking at abstracting it out to a third-party application and seeing how the community takes it. I really think it's exciting, and I'm just watching it and seeing where it lands. It's still early days at the moment, and if anyone else has an opinion, jump in.
I think it's worth noting that this has triggered a change, and not just this, but this has triggered a change in how the Kubernetes project treats beta. So pod security policies has been in beta for basically ever and hasn't changed, I think, in the last 5 or 6 releases. The new policy as of like the latest release of Kubernetes a couple of days ago is that things are basically, I think you have 2 releases now, and it's either then those features are deprecated, or you have to release a new beta, or you have to reach the conditions to go to stable. So there's some pressure being added into the system, which I think is good to stop these features just being left around. I think that in hindsight, pod security policies addresses specific needs, but the actual need is bigger. So basically, people found that it's useful but not sufficient. Therefore, having something else outside that actually duplicated that functionality, you needed that as well. So you might as well just have that. And that I think is allowing innovation to happen outside. Again, I'm involved in the Open Policy Agent project, but there's others as well. I think Caverno is one off the top of my head. There's a number of other tools with different approaches, different user interfaces. And I think that wouldn't happen if we just had said pod security policies is the answer.
No, I agree, and I like the idea of abstracting it. And security, I mean, pod security policies are right at the edge of Kube anyway, in many ways, in that they're an admission controller, right? So abstracting is a little more straightforward than some other things.
Okay. Moving on, next question. Are we really making a big deal of this? Seems like that's the question or the tenor of the question here. Have you ever seen node modules going rogue in Kubernetes? Do you know about any attacks targeting Kubernetes clusters in general? And how would we protect against those kind of attacks? Obviously, I think we have talked quite a bit about, in generalities, but are we really making a bigger deal than it should be? I guess is the tenor of the question here. Or maybe I'm reading it wrong. Phil, you there? You want to start? Or yeah, okay. So Kirsten, do you want to go?
So that's an interesting one. I mean, I think that, I'm used to getting questions about pods going rogue. Nodes going rogue is even more interesting, right? So I think there are a couple of things to look at and maybe related to the host OS when we're talking nodes in particular, right? So all right. Then I'm going to hand off to someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I figured out how to get off mute. It was stuck for a second, but so
no worries, Phil. Go for it.
Yeah. So I don't understand the connection with node modules, but the rest of the question is interesting in that there are quite a few security and infosec people making a name for themselves. I think giving talks even in the last 2 hours, there were a couple talks about very specific attacks and CVEs. So there are clearly attacks that target Kubernetes specifically. There's been some great talks even across the last few KubeCons. about ways to target and attack Kubernetes clusters, and obviously there's been a good response from the Kubernetes security team in closing some of these holes. It's a huge, wide open discussion about how could we protect against these kinds of attacks. That's the whole nature of the vendor industry around Kubernetes, the security tooling, the ways you can harden clusters, the way you can harden the operating system. So I think there's way too much that we wouldn't even have time to go into. But I would say there's a lot of great resources being produced, even here during KubeCon, about various attacks and the mitigations for them for clusters.
Thank you, Phil. That's a good
I'd say
segue
into.
let me give you one moment, Gareth. Basically, what I want to do was kind of wrap it up in a little bit. But Gareth, definitely, I'll give you a chance. But once Gareth finishes this answering this question, I'll go around. Just if you want to. All the panelists, if you want to summarize and maybe a few last words, I would appreciate if all of you want to join the app dev channel on Slack. We will carry on the discussion there. Having said that, Gareth, please go.
I was just going to say, I think one of the most sort of common things you hear about securing Kubernetes at the moment is still basically just publicly accessible control planes. I think it's that there are advanced threats, there are advanced attackers, but please secure your like Kubernetes API server on the internet. That's still the thing that's going to unfortunately end up with you often running a load of crypto miners. Most people aren't, and some people are working in industries and organizations where people really care about you. Often it's just they want to spend your money on compute so they can walk away with money. So please secure your API servers, and then think about securing your applications, and then think about more advanced attackers and attacks.
Great. I know there's a huge list of questions, and Kubernetes security is not easy to talk in about 40 minutes, but hopefully you'll join our Slack discussion, app dev on Slack. But I'll give, I really want to thank the panelists. I know Scott woke up at 1:00, to kind of do this panel, which is great. I don't think I would have done that, but really want to thank everybody, the panelists, all of you for the great questions. And what I'll do is I'll give in the last 2 minutes, if we can go around, starting with Scott and then going down. If you have anything, quick last few words.
Put me on the spot. No, I don't really have anything, but I'll try to think of something quickly.
That's fine.
I think with Kubernetes security, the one thing when I speak to customers or folks out there is think about your risk compared to the controls that you're trying to put in place, and don't read a blog post and think that there's doom and gloom because someone said everything's unsecure, or then read another blog post and say everything is secure. Just have a look at your business needs, have a look at your risk management, and then have a look at what controls you can put around Kubernetes to make it flexible for your application developers, but also have a good security posture. I think once you try to start looking in that sort of realm, you'll start to kick some goals.
Thank you. Gareth, you're next.
Yeah, I'd say if you've come along to this panel, if you're interested in security in this area, come get involved. If you're an expert, that's fine. If you're not, there are some serious experts to learn from. I think learning security in the context of this community is actually probably more approachable than lots of other places you could do so. Join in with SIG Security, join in with the policy working group. There's the CNCF sort of doing some security bits and pieces, and the projects. Open Policy Agent, Parsec now, Falco. There's a lot of individual projects if you prefer to write some code. Just get involved. There's a lot to learn, but also a lot to contribute.
Perfect. Moving on, Kirsten.
Yeah, great thoughts from everybody. And I just want to echo one thought that was mentioned briefly earlier, I think maybe by Gareth, but I think culture is an element that we really, that it can be easy to neglect when we focus on the technology. So Kube and containers, they challenge some of the traditional approaches to security. The same principles really apply. They apply in new ways. But I think the cultural shift is in many ways the most important one to try and tackle. And the more that you get involved, the more that you learn, the better able you may be to help your organization kind of make that shift left and collaborate and break down the silos for our new cloud native world.
Perfect. Phil, last thoughts.
Yeah, great panel. Thanks for inviting me. I think even, as Gareth said, if you're interested, there's so much out there. Even just scrolling through the security, identity, policy track from the last few days. I know I moderated a talk by Andrew Martin earlier today that had tons of detail just on container isolation. So, depending on your area of interest, depending on what layer of the stack you're thinking about securing, there's a ton of great information and resources and places to get involved. So definitely encourage people to keep digging, no matter what your level of expertise.
Thank you again. Thanks everyone for attending. Thank the panelists, but I would be also remiss if I wouldn't thank the people behind the scenes. There's a whole tech crew who's helping here. I would love to thank, the CNCF for doing such a great job. Scott, who's behind the scene, Matt, who's behind the scene. Thank you all very much. With that said, we are just a little bit over, but thanks again, and let's carry on the discussion at AppDev on the Slack channel. Bye.